listener for the Drupal web form module is the most powerful way that you can track activity on your Drupal web forms. Now, once we turn on the listener, we can jump into the features screen, navigate to form activity, and take a look at all the various things this listener can do for us. Now, ListenLayer will push information into the user's data layer as structured data when they take certain actions related to your Drupal web forms. For example, when a user loads a page that contains a form, structured information, which you can see an example of, will be pushed into the data layer. Once that information is in the data layer, Google Tag Manager can read that. You can write variables and trigger rules inside of GTM to capture that information. In addition, we can track single page form submissions. We can capture information when form validations fail as a result of a user not filling in a field correctly. And we can also capture Drupal web forms multi-page or multi-step forms. So if you have any of the more advanced multiple page form setup, this will allow you to track not only when a form submission occurs, but you can capture information as users progress through that multi-stage form. Now, each of these activity elements is going to generate an event into the data layer, and there's additional settings for those events here. Again, you can see examples of what the code from each of these features looks like, but we'll also take a look at that directly in the browser. Before we do, it's important to note that when you first turn on the Drupal module and we haven't received any activity from our website yet, we're not going to see any variables populating in the variable settings screen. As the listener on your website collects information from your live Drupal web forms, it will push fields and characteristics of those forms into this screen where you can use them to write custom rules. So if you're seeing that this is empty, what you'll need to do is go ahead and turn those features on and publish. So let's do that, and then we'll take a look at our live website. So here we are on our live example Drupal website. After having published our ListenLayer changes, I'm going to go ahead and do a hard refresh just to make sure I'm getting all the latest information. And on this page, we have a couple web forms from the Drupal web form module. If I jump into the console of my browser and focus on these events that are coming through, you'll be able to see that this is the information that is being pushed into the data layer from ListenLayer. So recall that back on this screen, we have turned on all of these features, and each of these features will push specific events along with information into the data layer. So what we're seeing is an event called DP form loaded, and we're seeing it multiple times, which would indicate that there are multiple forms on the screen. And within all of the data layer activity, what you will find is a section that contains automatic values and a section that contains custom values. Automatic values are the pieces of information that ListenLayer collects from the form without you having to write any rules. For example, the form ID here, Drupal Web Forms uses the name of the form to generate a form ID, and it also will sometimes add on the node number that the form is sitting inside of. And so we collect that automatically, and you can actually use that with a rule that would say, form ID contains, and then the name of the form. You'd probably want to not include the different nodes since they can be placed in multiple places. And you can use that to actually push custom values into the data layer. For example, you can categorize your forms for conversion tracking. that can actually be done by turning on the custom data layers feature, which we'll talk about in a little bit. In addition to collecting form ID, the form location is always collected, as well as individual details about the form itself. Now, all of this information can be more easily seen inside of the Google Tag Manager debug tool. Ultimately, the goal is to build a scalable structure in Google Tag Manager that reads this data layer, converts the important pieces of information into variables, sets triggers based on these events, and then can be used to power all of your web analytics tracking at scale. So let's jump into Google Tag Manager and take a look at this in the debug view. So here you can see we've now launched the Google Tag Manager debug. And the 3 form loaded events that we saw originally in our console are actually being read by Google Tag Manager and pulled into the debug view here. So here is the data layer information that's being pushed into the data layer by ListenLayer when a form loads on a page. And again, you can see the set of automatic values. You can see the custom values is currently empty, form location, form ID, all of those things, much easier to see in this view. Google Tag Manager then reads those, and you can easily capture any of those variables into Google Tag Manager by creating a custom variable in GTM. And you can easily target one of those. For example, let's say I want to get my form ID. You can right click here and click property path. So let's take a look at some of the additional features. I'm going to attempt to submit this initial form. And notice we have a validation error that has occurred because I didn't fill in a required piece of information. And ListenLayer has automatically detected that and pushed that information into the data layer. So I could capture this event as a trigger and also maybe some of the information about the error itself, which fields, and push that into an analytics tracking tool. Or perhaps if I want to monitor my form validation errors, but I do not want to push that into a tool like Google Tag Manager, I could actually turn on data layer reporting directly inside of ListenLayer and use ListenLayer to track certain things like that that I might not want to messy up my overall analytics tool with. So let's go ahead and fill out this form. Some test information. And just to see what happens live, we'll switch back there. And you can see that as soon as the form is actually successfully submitted, meaning the data was collected and pushed through, we fire an event. And this event is what you would use to track conversion tracking based on, as opposed to using a thank you page, which is notoriously inaccurate and is probably creating a subpar user experience on your website. This is much more reliable. Now, this event is obviously being generated based on the form submission feature here. If you do redirect users to a thank you page, you can use a feature here called push events after redirect. And once this is enabled, a number of events over here are going to be eligible to be turned on, to have this feature turned on. And what it does is the data layer information that comes from the actual form submission is collected based on the true form submission, but it's not actually pushed into the data layer until the following page after the redirect. And so if you're using this to debug in the console, or if you always redirect users to a thank you page, you can go ahead and fire that event on that thank you page, which can oftentimes be useful and actually can be more reliable depending on how much information is loading on the pages before the redirect. Okay, so let's jump back to our web forms. And Now we're going to take a look at a multi-step form down at the bottom, multi-page form. So we're going to complete the first step of this form, the page, and we're going to move to the second page of the form. And notice what occurred before we actually loaded to that full second step is that the first step was completed. Now you can see the form ID again can be targeted. And what you can do with this is you can track the actual stages of the form and the progress that a user makes through the form. Now, Drupal Web Forms does not actually identify or name each of the steps in a way that can be easily pulled into the data layer. And so what most users do is they push custom information into the custom values based on the step the user completed. And they can do that by identifying which fields had existed and what the form ID was. And then you can, for example, you can write a rule in ListenLayer that would name this as, form step 1. Or it would identify it as form step 1, and you could also include an additional name. So that's a high-level overview of the Drupal listener. There are some additional features that you can dig into. For example, browser storage. You can capture information from the data layer, and you can actually store that in a cookie, in local storage, and in session storage. The benefit of that is that those browser storage elements have different rules around how they persist and how you can access and utilize them. So there's many different use cases for those. In addition, we talked about data layer reporting. You can also turn on data layer monitoring, which allows you to write rules. And those rules will trigger notifications to you when certain things happen or don't happen in your data layer. So if you're overseeing analytics for a website, you can write some really cool rules to help monitor what's going on your website, identify errors, and various things of that nature. Hope you enjoy using the Drupal web form listener.